When we think of the south of France, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, we think of a playground for the rich and famous. But did you know, at one time the rich and famous thought of the Alberni Valley as their playground? Here I am with Jamie Morton, manager of the Alberni Valley Museum. Hi, Jamie. I was doing a bit of research and I noticed that the Alberni Valley was quite popular in touristry at one time.
That's true, Gerald, it was. It took a couple of things to make that happen. First of all, it was the overall move towards tourism generally on a national, international, continental level. And that took a couple of different things happening. Until the middle of the later 19th century, tourism as we understand it didn't really exist. But a few things changed. First of all, more people became literate. They started reading about exotic places. They started being interested in places other than their own homes. So there was that sort of interest on the part of the wider population. Now, very wealthy people had traveled for years and years and years, the whole Grand Tour thing in Europe and everything. But that didn't really apply to regular folks. One of the things that changed is that in the 1880s, 1890s, more and more people were working in factories or in offices, some kind of 9-to-5 type job. They would have regular, predictable days off, like a farmer would be working 7 days a week, 20 hours a day in some cases. But now when people were working in these urban jobs, they had more of a chance to plan getting away. They had days off, and it made it possible sometimes to even put those together and get a vacation of some sort. You could travel someplace else, get away, and get away from the urban environment, from the factory environment, the office environment that you worked in on a regular basis. Now, the other thing that came together with that was the resettlement of the Alberni Valley. And people started to move in. They were mostly looking for resources. They were looking to farm. A lot of people in the Alberni side, the north side of the valley, were looking for farmsteads of one sort or another and started clearing land, growing crops, keeping animals. You also get people getting interested in the forest industry again and starting to move into that sector as well as fishing. Now, because there wasn't really an easy way to get here, you had to pretty much come by water. But everybody that came here at that time was seeing what a beautiful place it was. So a lot of the features of the area, the beaches, the rivers, the lakes, the forests, really impressed people. There were wonderful things to see, wonderful places to go. So all of a sudden, you've got these two things coming together. You've sort of got this drive towards tourism, this ability of people to take trips for leisure, just for fun, to get away. A lot of the time they want to see the wilderness. They want to see forests and mountains and streams and all the good things that have now been identified in the Alberni Valley.
How did people come to the valley? How did they get here?
Well, this is part of what made the whole tourism thing possible in the Alberni Valley. There were a couple of things came together, again, to make it happen. The first of these was the railway. The ENN, of course, was in on the east side of the island already. Eventually, they decided they were going to put that into the Port Alberni area. And the reason for that was the development that was going on. This is after the sawmills had started down on the harbor front. You had the agriculture and so forth that we talked about earlier already in place. And the ENN perceived that there was a need for some kind of connection. When the CPR took over the ENN in 1907, this made it happen. Because they already had the CP steamships that were coming to the harbor, they wanted to connect with this, make a Vancouver Island kind of link or circle that would connect all these activities together. So they started putting in the line across. As part of this, they were looking at passenger service also. And the CPR had very much an interest in tourism, in bringing people into areas. They sold more tickets that way. So rather than just carrying lumber or carrying materials to sell in the stores, they wanted to move people back and forth also. When we talk about some of the accommodation in the area, The Cameron Lake Chalet was actually constructed by the CPR specifically as accommodation for tourists. Now, the other thing that happened at the same time, the first passenger train arrived in Port Alberni at the station we've got there now, or in that location, in December of 1911. That was a big, big event. It meant that you could travel straight from Victoria to Port Alberni on the train. Just a few months later, in May of 1912, Alberni, not Port Alberni, but Alberni, was defined as mile zero of the Trans-Canada Highway. And there was a huge interest. This was the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Cars were a big, big deal. The idea of being mobile, being able to take yourself somewhere with an automobile was really, really important. And there were a group of local boosters as well as people out of Victoria and Vancouver who were really encouraging what they called then auto tourism. And the idea was you had to find a place to go. It was ideal if it was within a day or two of home. You could maybe stay somewhere, then drive back the next day. So this was another thing that occurred exactly at the same time that passenger rail service occurred. Both these things, Port Alberni and Alberni, of course, was the end of the road, the end of the line. So this is where people had to stop. It made it a natural sort of environment for tourism that way.
And I believe the mile zero brought a little bit of, not animosity, but a little bit of a disagreement between Alberni and Port Alberni.
There was some controversy. Some bad people from Port Alberni stole the mile zero marker from Alberni, not wanting Alberni to get the credit. They said, Port Alberni's the terminus, not Alberni, and tried to make that point dramatic.
You had mentioned the roads. I believe the roads would not be quite what we recognize now. They were a little bit probably rougher at that time. They
were gravel, dirt roads, and it was much better than what they'd had in the 1880s when the provincial government road was put in. The road that went to the East Coast, that was contracted out and built in the 1880s, and the mail service was running on that. And there was also a passenger coach from the East Coast. But the roads meant that people could get themselves there. You didn't need to hire a coach. You didn't need to buy a ticket. You just hop in your car and get your chauffeur to drive you where you were going. Because there was a lot of wealthy people that tended to have automobiles then.
That must have been quite the thing, and I'm sure the people were quite happy to get to some of these lodges when they finally arrived. It's the turn of the 20th century, and change is everywhere. And there's a renewed optimism in the province. There is an air of elation on Vancouver Island as the CPR is buying out the ENN. CPR gets all of the ENN's assets plus $2.3 million in land grants. $2.3 million is not pocket change when you consider that the average farm laborer makes only approximately $30 a month. But this deal comes with the promise to extend the line to Courtenay by 1915. It's not long before the Alberni Land Company makes a deal with the ENN to bring the rail line into the Alberni Valley. And that will increase the ENN's property holdings by approximately 2,300 acres. Finally, in 1906, the surveys are started under the command of Frank Shepherd, the provincial land surveyor. A number of routes are explored, but after a year, a final route is settled on. The route that is selected will go to Parksville, and then from Parksville it will divide, going north to Campbell River, and then west to Port Alberni. At the turn of the 20th century, building a rail line is a little bit more difficult. There's no bulldozers, no excavators. It's done with hundreds of men using picks and shovels, axes, cutting trees, laying the rail beds, laying the tracks. By 1910, they're taking passengers to Cameron Lake and the chalet that is already built there. The chalet had been constructed while the rail line was being built as a terminus. It wasn't long before the chalet was drawing visitors from around the province. They were coming to enjoy the fishing and beautiful trails that we have in the area. Finally, in December of 1911, the rail comes to Port Alberni. But this is more than just a train. This is a link to the outside world. People and products can move much easier now. The valley is opening up, waiting to be discovered. And discovered it will be.
The Cameron Lake Chalet was built by the CPR specifically as tourist accommodation. It had nice accommodation, didn't have electricity initially, so they were struggling around that a little bit, but it was furnished like a standard CPR hotel. That is, it had the corporate red carpet, beautifully finished woodwork, lovely furniture that was brought in specifically for that purpose. And when we look at the people that were staying there, we've got some of the old ledgers from the lodge, and it is people with a lot of money. It's titled people, it's wealthy business people, it's people signing their chauffeurs in, having separate rooms, probably not quite as fancy as the ones they were getting. They also built in the idea of recreation as part of that. So from the Cameron Lake Chalet, they developed a whole network of trails, some of which are still there. The trail up Arrowsmith is part of what was originally developed by the CPR to service their tourist population. People wanted that outdoor experience, that authentic experience as part of their adventure. The other places tended to be more independent, so it starts with the Somas Hotel. The original Somas in Port Alberni was opened in about 1908. It was there as originally a harbor hotel to service people that were coming and going by sea, but it was also right across the street from where the railway station was put. So it meant that it became a railway hotel at that point. It was sort of a jumping off point to other adventures in the Alberni Valley. You could hire a car that would take you up to Great Central Lake from there, and there you might stay in the Ark, which was a floating hotel, sometimes called the Ark Hotel, built by Joe Drinkwater. A number of rooms that were floating in a houseboat on the lake. You could again rent another smaller one or go to a cabin up the lake. Also, you have Klitza Lodge, the one that we're in the scene of, is one of the more famous ones, mostly because of the rich and famous and great and good that showed up there through the years. It had a formidable proprietress through most of its existence, Mrs. Josephine Wark, who was sort of a local icon. But she ran a very luxurious hotel. One of the exceptions to this was she didn't believe in windows. So apparently the bugs and everything could get in relatively freely. Mostly a summer operation, well, pretty much exclusively a summer operation. Silver cutlery being used, china, white tablecloths, but it was very rustic. You would go out and have your experience on the lake or hiking or being engaged somehow in the outdoors, but a nice place to come back to when you slept at the end of the day. It was typical of what the higher end tourists did want, was a comfortable experience, but something that made them feel like they were roughing it at the same time.
I'm sure that's what people coming today would expect too. Kirsten Smith has kindly let me borrow some gloves here at the museum so I can rather gently interact with a few of these exhibits.
That's right. Our job here is to take care of artifacts here for generations, so we need to treat them very gently so that they will last a very long time.
And what have we got right here? What is this particular
This here
item?
is a lovely bedroom set from the Cameron Lake Chalet. So the bed is here and the dresser, and these are actually the very first artifacts that came into the museum collection in 1966. They were a donation from Helen Ford, one of the founders of the museum. It's been on display for a number of years, but it's sort of been in pieces up in the furniture collection. So here we got to pull it out, put it all together, and make it up as a bed. And it's a whole different effect to see it all made up as a bed.
The blanket is quite an interesting color in relation to the rest of it. Is there a reason for that?
We've put this blanket out here. This was used in town. Actually, one of the ambulance services had it made up for their ambulance, but the CPR made it for them. So it's in the CPR colors. And because the Cameron Lake Chalet was one of the CPR hotels, we've sort of put it on the bed to help make it up.
And I believe the bed set is actually a CPR standard bed set?
This nice mahogany set, you probably could have found them in lots of CPR hotels. So it was a very fancy bed, but then within at the Cameron Lake Chalet, there wasn't running water. So you had a really nice bed and then a basin with water because, yeah. It was opened in, what, 1912. The people that came to stay here were often booked in with their chauffeur, you know, or their maid servant, or the nanny to take care of the children. It wasn't necessarily an everyday. This was quite a fancy place to be staying, even without the running water. Here we have our Emily Carr, and it was this painting in combination with the interior shots of Klitza Lodge. It's nice to have interior shots of building, often you get the sort of outside of it, that became the sort of the seeds of inspiration for this whole exhibit. It sort of grew out of that. We knew that Emily Carr stayed at Klitza Lodge. So this is painted at Sprout Lake. So it's an Emily Carr at Sprout Lake, though probably not the typical Emily Carr style that you might be used to, because this is one of her earlier pieces. So those interior shots that we were talking about of Klitza Lodge, this is one of them that we've blown up. There are several shots. We were probably taken as promotional pieces during Josephine Wark's time. And we've blown up one of the most interesting. They're really nice quality shots, so we can make them really big while they're still interesting. And then we complement it with some different pieces. These pieces are from the museum's collection. We've had some pieces on loan from the public. And then there's, you can see there's a couple like Leonard Frank photographs up on the walls, and we've added a few of our own that we have in the collection as well.
Thank you, Kirsten, for this visit to Klitza Lodge. Klitza Lodge was built in the first part of the 20th century and run by a local personality, Mrs. Wark. Upon her death in 1942, the Cole family purchased the property. Bob, their son, still lives out on Sprout Lake, and his early life is part of Klitza Lodge.
I was mistaken as Olivia de Havilland's child when she was here on her honeymoon in 1947. She was holding me as a baby, and the local paper took a picture and said Olivia de Havilland with her child on honeymoon, which in 1947 you're not supposed to have a child and be on your honeymoon.
It was a fitting start to Bob's childhood, as Sprout Lake was very much the playground of the rich and famous. And Klitza Lodge is where they came and stayed.
I had a good friend and a fellow named Mark Seaton, my age, and they came up a few summers in a row, and their dad was George Seaton, and I never knew who they were. I just knew they were from Hollywood. And this winter I was watching Miracle on 34th or whatever it is, the famous Christmas show. The director of that movie was George Seaton. He was also an assistant director in Gone with the Wind and other famous Hollywood movies. I never knew how famous the guy was, but I liked his son. We shot our BB guns together and things like that. So we used to get Christmas cards from Jane Wyman, from was it Fred McMurray, Walt and Roy Disney came up and stayed at Klitza Lodge before building Disneyland, and I think it had an influence on them. The guest book, the Lodge guest book, is at the museum, and I think some of the people are highlighted. Some of them used a nom de plume when they were here, or an alias and that, so you had to know if they were here or not.
Given there were so many Americans, how did they manage to find Sprout Lake?
I think there were quite a few promotions of Sprout Lake in the Hollywood and California area, because that's how the people found us. I know my parents didn't market down there, and a lot of the people came before my parents owned the lodge. They were just return guests on that. There's a lot of fishing at the lake. It was famous for fishing. And George I. Warren, who was the head of the Vancouver Island Tourist Bureau, in fact, started it, founded it. He and and Eva Warren, his wife, I called them Uncle George and Aunt Eva, they came to the lodge on a regular basis. Great fishing people. I have pictures of them with 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-pound trout on a regular basis, out fishing out here and that.
It doesn't sound much different from today, but one exception. Tourism was huge at the time of Klitza Lodge. Today, operators are struggling to find their niche.
There were 5 resorts on the lake at one time, between Wilson's Cottages and the Bishop's Landing, and there was 2 motels and 1 down Sterling Arm, and they all were always booked, very hard to get into. I think the values are still here. The fishing's still here, the water's still clear, but it doesn't have the facilities.
So we had quite a thriving tourism going here. What happened to it over time?
So the 2 things. First of all, the passenger trains stopped running to Alberni. They were still carrying lumber, still involved in industrial activities, but you couldn't just buy a ticket anymore from Victoria to Alberni. Starting in about, I think it was 1958-ish, that the passenger trains stopped running. At the same time, the highway was put in right out to the west coast. They started developing this more and more during the Second World War, but it was turned into a much better highway in the 1950s. So now people who were traveling from Vancouver, Victoria, Seattle, from the mainland, were looking at getting out to the West Coast. That was sort of being pitched as the new wilderness experience. It's the new best thing, and everybody wanted to get out there. So more and more, the accommodation that existed here was used just kind of as a way station. So whereas Cameron Lake Lodge had been, or Chalet had been one of the destination resorts, now all of a sudden it was a place you might stay on your way back and forth. Likewise at Bishop's Landing or at Klitzel Lodge, people, instead of booking in for a week or 2 weeks, would book in for a night just on their way out to the West Coast. And it started to make it not viable anymore as a tourism activity. So things started to close down a little bit. The economy, of course, was doing great in that period anyway, with the forest industry really taking off. So people didn't really miss the loss of tourism. In fact, if anything, it was nice for locals because they didn't have competition for the hiking trails, the fishing, the hunting, all the things that they enjoyed doing, and the things that brought people to live in the community. However, since the forest industry slowed down a bit, starting in the 80s and 90s and more at the present day, we all are now looking at how can we get tourism back here. And there's always this idea, well, there's 2 million people, 3 million people going out to the West Coast every year. How can we get some of them to stay here, enjoy our environment, the beautiful things that we still have to offer here, and stay here for a while to share these with us? And it really is a problem. A lot of people are looking at that, the city's looking at that, Chamber of Commerce looking at that, all the other organizations involved in tourism, trying to figure out how we can rebuild this status as a place where people go, not just a place that people pass through and spend their vacation dollars here, hopefully. We want to become Vacationland again.
Of course we do. Well, thank you, Jamie. That was quite interesting.
You're very welcome, Gerald.
Some of the best ideas for tourism seem to come from the past. You can find them at the Alberni Valley Museum. I'm Gerald Labute, your local time traveler, and we'll see you in time, whenever that time may be.